The scratching came at midnight, violent and desperate against weathered oak. Elias Whitefeather's hand trembled on his rifle as the Algonquin blizzard howled its fury. Rattling windows sealed against nature's rage. 20 years of wilderness solitude hadn't prepared him for what waited beyond that door. When he opened it, snow swirled around a shadow-made flesh, a massive black panther, sides heaving with more than exhaustion. Her golden eyes met his, and in that impossible moment, recognition sparked between predator and man. The scar on her left ear, shaped like a crescent moon, told an ancient story of steel traps and mercy. She collapsed at his threshold, her body convulsing with primal contractions. Blood-spotted pristine snow as life fought to enter a frozen world. The panther's eyes held no wild fury, only the universal plea of mother to protect her, a request that transcended species, time, and reason itself. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Elias Whitefeather stood frozen in his doorway, a man carved from 58 winters of sorrow and survival. His weathered face bore the deep lines of someone who'd lived too much life too quickly. Silver threading through black hair that hadn't seen a barber since Maggie used to trim it on Sunday mornings. Those calloused hands that now gripped the doorframe had built this cabin 40 miles from the nearest town. Board by board, nail by nail. Trying to hammer away memories that refused to stay buried. The cabin itself was a monument to isolation, hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. Windows triple-paned against nature's mood swings. Inside, a stone fireplace dominated the main room, its mantel holding dust-covered photographs of a dark-haired woman and a girl with eyes like summer. Emily's crayon drawings still clung to the refrigerator door, 5 years faded but never removed. In the corner, medical equipment gathered dust, the oxygen tank, the portable defibrillator tools that might have saved them if the blizzard hadn't swallowed the road to town that night. This was Algonquin wilderness at its most primitive, where wolves still sang funeral dirges to the moon and the nearest neighbor was Sarah Morningstar. 12 miles through forest that could kill you 9 different ways before breakfast. The storm now raging was the worst in a decade. Weather services had warned. But Elias had stopped listening to warnings. The night warnings couldn't save his family. He'd chosen this exile deliberately, methodically, the way a monk chooses a monastery or a prisoner accepts his cell. Each morning began with splitting wood until his shoulders screamed, checking barometric pressure on instruments that predicted everything except heartbreak, and maintaining supply lists for a siege that had already happened. The surrounding forest of ancient pines had become both his congregation and his penance, their whispers holding conversations with ghosts who answered back in dreams. 5 years of solitude had taught him the weight of silence, how it pressed against eardrums like deep water, how it could suffocate or sanctify depending on the day. He'd learned to live with the guilt that bloomed in his chest each morning, the survivor's curse of drawing breath when loved ones couldn't. Nature had been his only companion, neither judging nor forgiving, simply existing in its brutal honesty. Now, as this impossible visitor lay dying and birthing on his doorstep, Elias felt the universe cracking open, demanding he choose between the safety of isolation and the terrible risk of caring again. The panther's breathing came in ragged gasps that misted in the freezing air, each exhale a small ghost dissipating into the storm. Elias stood paralyzed for 3 heartbeats, his mind wrestling with impossibility, while his body remembered older truths. This creature shouldn't exist here. Panthers had been gone from Algonquin for 70 years, yet here she was, flanks rippling with contractions, blood staining the virgin snow beneath her massive frame. Her golden eyes never left his face, and in them, he saw something that shattered his careful walls of isolation. Recognition. Not the vague familiarity of species encountering species, but specific, personal knowing. His gaze traveled to her left ear, where an old scar curved like a crescent moon through black fur. The memory hit him like a physical blow 12 years ago. A young ranger named Elias Whitefeather had spent 3 hours cutting a panther cub free from an illegal steel trap, his hands steady despite the mother's warning growls from nearby brush. That cub had looked at him with these same golden eyes while he worked, never struggling, as if understanding his intent. When finally freed, It had pressed its small head against his palm for just a moment before limping back to its hidden mother. He'd never reported the encounter, knowing it would bring hunters and scientists swarming. Some secrets were meant to be kept between souls. Now that cub had returned as a mother herself, driven by desperation to seek help from the only human she'd ever trusted. The massive cat tried to rise but collapsed again, a keening sound escaping her throat that transcended species' pure maternal anguish. Her abdomen contracted violently, and Elias saw movement beneath her fur, life fighting to emerge. The decision came not from his mind, but from somewhere deeper, that place where Maggie's voice still lived. "Help her," it whispered, and his body moved before doubt could poison action. He backed slowly into the cabin, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening, then began gathering what he'd need. The thick wool blankets came first, the ones Maggie had woven on her grandmother's loom, stored in cedar these 5 years. He pulled them out, their patterns of eagles and mountains still vibrant, and felt her approval in their warmth. From the kitchen, he filled his largest pot with water and set it on the wood stove to boil. Muscle memory from Emily's birth guiding his hands. Clean towels from the bathroom, the first aid kit from under the sink, even the heating pad he used for his back, everything that might help. He spread the blankets near the fireplace, creating a nest in the warmest corner of the cabin. The fire crackled with fresh logs, throwing dancing shadows against the walls where Emily's drawings seemed to watch with paper eyes. His hands worked steadily, but his mind reeled with the magnitude of what he was doing. Harboring a panther, protected or not, was federal crime. If she hurt him, no one would find his body until spring. Yet none of that mattered against the ancient contract written in her eyes. Returning to the door, he found her watching his preparations with intelligent assessment. "Come on, Mama," he said softly, his voice rusty from disuse. "Let's get you inside where it's warm." He stepped back, leaving the door wide open despite the snow driving in. She understood. With enormous effort, she dragged herself across the threshold, leaving a trail of blood and amniotic fluid on his clean floors. Each movement was agony, but she pressed forward until she reached the blankets, collapsing onto them with a sound that was part relief, part surrender. Elias closed the door against the storm and knelt at what he judged was safe distance. The panther's eyes tracked his movement, but her body was focused inward now, consumed by the ancient rhythm of birth. He found himself humming, almost unconsciously, an Ojibwe lullaby his grandmother had sung, about the moon watching over all Earth's children. The melody seemed to calm her, or perhaps it was simply his presence, steady and unthreatening, that allowed her to release into the process. The first cub came as the clock struck 1, emerging in a rush of fluid and instinct. The mother immediately began cleaning it with her rough tongue, and Elias watched in awe as the tiny creature took its first breath, mewing pitifully before finding its mother's warmth. It was perfect, dark as midnight, already showing the powerful build of its kind. But the mother's work wasn't done. Her body convulsed again, and Elias saw her strength flagging. The second cub's birth was harder, longer. The mother's tongue lolled with exhaustion, and when the baby finally emerged, Elias immediately saw why. The cub's left hind leg was twisted, malformed. It lay still while its mother frantically licked it, trying to stimulate life into the tiny form. For horrible seconds, nothing happened. Then, finally, a weak cry, barely audible over the storm. The cub lived, but even Elias's untrained eye could see it would never run like its sibling. The mother gathered both cubs against her belly, her great head falling back with exhaustion. Her eyes found Elias again, and in them he read a complete story: trust, gratitude, and something else. Fear. Not of him, but for her cubs. Especially the damaged one. She knew, as all wild mothers know, that nature rarely forgives imperfection. Her gaze asked a question he wasn't ready to answer. As the storm raged outside, Elias watched this impossible family settle into his home, his life, his heart. The healthy cub nursed vigorously while its siblings struggled to compete. The mother's eyes kept returning to him, as if measuring his character against some standard only she understood. And Elias, who thought he'd finished with love and its terrible responsibilities, felt something crack open inside his chest, not breaking, but possibly, impossibly, beginning to heal. Dawn came late through the blizzard's veil, a grudging gray light that found Elias asleep in his rocking chair, the rifle across his lap forgotten. He woke to being watched, not with predatory intent, but with the measured assessment of another parent. The mother panther lay exactly where he'd left her, both cubs tucked against her belly, but her golden eyes tracked his every movement with preternatural awareness. The storm had softened to steady snowfall, muffling the world in white silence, moving slowly to avoid startling her. Elias stood and stretched, muscles cramped from sleeping upright. In clearer light, he could properly see the second cub, and his heart sank. The left hind leg wasn't just twisted, it was significantly underdeveloped, the foot turned inward at an impossible angle. In the wild, such a cub would be dead within weeks, unable to keep up with the hunt, unable to flee danger. The mother knew it too. He could see the knowledge in how she kept positioning herself to shield that particular baby from view. "Let me help," Elias said softly, taking a single step forward. The mother's ears flattened, a warning rumble deep in her chest. He stopped, hands visible, and remembered something from his ranger training decades ago. Panthers, like all cats, responded to routine, to predictable patterns that suggested safety. He needed to become part of her world's rhythm, not an intrusion into it. He moved to the kitchen, keeping his movements visible and deliberate. From the freezer, he pulled venison steaks. He'd been saving meat from a deer that had been hit by a logging truck and left to die until he'd ended its suffering. He set the meat to thaw near the fire, not too close to the panthers, but within smell range. The mother's nostrils flared, but she didn't move. Patience. Then, everything with wild things required patience. While the meat warmed, Elias carefully examined the smaller cub from a distance. His ranger training included basic veterinary knowledge, and what he saw gave him hope. The leg wasn't broken, just malformed. With support, possibly a splint, the cub might develop compensating muscles. It would never be normal, but it might survive. He thought of Emily's friend from school, born with cerebral palsy, who'd learned to run in her own way, leg braces flashing in the sun. Nature might not forgive imperfection, but sometimes it could be convinced to accommodate it. The healthy cub woke first, mewing for milk, and its mother obliged with patient licks between nursing. Elias found himself naming them silently. The mother became Luna for her nighttime arrival, the healthy cub Shadow for its dark perfection, and the smaller one Hope for what it represented. Dangerous. These names made things matter. Names made leaving harder. But the words settled in his mind like stones in still water, sending ripples through his careful emptiness. By noon, Luna had accepted his presence enough to eat the venison he'd placed on a plate 6 feet away. She dragged it closer to her cubs but kept her eyes on him while she ate, powerful jaws making quick work of the meat. When she finished, she did something unexpected. She pushed the empty plate toward him with her nose, a gesture so deliberately communicative that it took his breath away. He understood. She was acknowledging the transaction, the covenant forming between them. "You're welcome, Luna," he said, using her name aloud for the first time. Her ears swiveled at the sound, and something shifted in her posture. Not quite relaxation, but a lessening of coiled readiness. He retrieved the plate slowly, and when he returned with more meat and a bowl of water, she allowed him to place them closer. Progress measured in inches, but progress nonetheless. That afternoon, while the cubs slept, Luna began grooming herself with methodical precision. Elias took the opportunity to really observe her, noting old scars beneath her fur that told stories of survival. One across her shoulder looked like a bullet graze. Another on her haunch suggested an encounter with something that fought back. She was magnificent in her prime, probably 7 or 8 years old, her coat lustrous despite her ordeal. But what struck him most was her intelligence, the way she processed his every movement, analyzed his intent, made calculated decisions about trust. When Shadow woke and stumbled away from its mother's warmth, heading toward Elias with the fearless curiosity of the very young, Luna made a soft chuffing sound. The cub stopped, looked back, then continued toward the strange giant sitting so still. Elias didn't move, hardly breathed. As tiny paws climbed onto his knee, needle claws pricking through his jeans, the cub sniffed his hand, then began purring a sound that seemed impossibly large for such a small creature. Luna watched but didn't intervene. Another test passed. By evening, Elias had fashioned a simple splint from popsicle sticks and medical tape, materials from when Emily had played doctor. Hope needed support if the leg was to develop any strength. But approaching the injured cub meant approaching Luna directly, and that required a level of trust they hadn't reached. He set the materials aside and simply sat, reading aloud from one of Emily's books he'd grabbed without thinking, something about a rabbit going to sleep. His voice, rusty from disuse, found its rhythm in the familiar words. Luna's eyes grew heavy. The storm outside continued its assault, but inside, a strange peace descended. Then the radio crackled to life, shattering the spell. Repeat. Dangerous predator sighted in Sector 7. Large cat, possibly cougar or escaped exotic. Livestock losses reported. Armed patrols authorized. Bounty set at $5,000 for confirmed kill. Elias switched it off with trembling fingers, but the damage was done. Luna had gone rigid. Her body curled protectively around her cubs. She understood danger even if she couldn't parse words. $5,000 was serious money in these parts, enough to bring out every would-be hunter with a rifle and a dream. Sector 7 was 12 miles south, but tracks in snow told stories, and Luna had certainly left a trail to his door. He moved through the cabin with newfound urgency, pulling heavy curtains across windows, checking door locks he hadn't used in years. The truck outside needed to be moved to block sight lines from the access road. Every precaution his ranger training had taught him about protecting safe houses for witnesses, except now he was protecting something far more precious and dangerous than any human fugitive. "They won't find you," he told Luna, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "I couldn't save my own family, but I'll be damned if I fail you." The words hung in the air like a vow, witnessed by the storm and the shadows. Luna's eyes held his for a long moment, and in them, he saw not just an animal's instinct, but something deeper, a mother's recognition of another parent who'd known loss. As darkness fell on their second day together, Elias found himself at a crossroads he hadn't seen coming. Every choice led to consequences, keeping them risked discovery and prosecution. Sending them out meant certain death for Hope, possibly both cubs in this storm. But wasn't that always the way with love? It arrived uninvited, demanding impossible choices, requiring you to risk everything for something that was never guaranteed. He made his decision while watching Hope struggle to nurse, its tiny body fighting for every drop of life. He'd build them a hidden shelter in the root cellar, stock it with supplies, create false trails if necessary. He'd lie to anyone who asked, break laws that needed breaking, because sometimes redemption came disguised as a problem you didn't ask for, wrapped in fur and claws instead of light and wings. The radio stayed silent the rest of the night, but Elias knew silence was just the storm catching its breath. By morning, the hunters would come, drawn by bounty and bloodlust. He had perhaps 10 hours to prepare for a siege that would test every skill he'd learned in 20 years of wilderness living. But first, he had to convince Luna to trust him completely, because their survival, all of them, would depend on perfect cooperation between species that had been enemies since humans first learned to fear the dark. Outside, the blizzard howled its ancient song of endings and beginnings, while inside, an impossible family began to form from the broken pieces of two different worlds, held together by nothing more than necessity, trust, and the faint hope that love might be enough. The second morning arrived with deceiving quiet, the storm having exhausted itself into gentle snowfall that decorated the world in pristine white lies. Elias woke to find Shadow batting at his bootlaces while Luna watched with what could only be described as maternal amusement. The little cub had claimed him, apparently, as an acceptable piece of furniture. Hope lay curled against its mother's warm belly, the makeshift splint Elias had managed to attach during the night still in place. Luna had allowed it only after hours of patience, letting him inch closer while he hummed that old Ojibwe lullaby until she finally, miraculously, lifted her great paw to let him work. The domestic scene should have been impossible, a man sharing his living room with apex predators, but here they were, existing in a bubble outside natural law. Elias prepared breakfast for all of them. Venison for Luna and formula he'd improvised from goat's milk and eggs for the cubs to supplement their nursing. Shadow attacked the bottle with fierce determination, while Hope needed coaxing, its smaller body working twice as hard for every swallow. "That's it, little warrior," Elias murmured, supporting Hope's head while it fed. "Every drop makes you stronger." Luna watched him handle her damaged cub with eyes that held too much understanding. He'd seen that look before in the mirror, the parent who knows their child faces a harder road than others, who measures love against futility and chooses love anyway. By afternoon, Shadow had discovered the joy of pouncing on anything that moved dust motes and sunbeams, the fringe on Maggie's old Afghan, and particularly Hope's tail. The smaller cub tried to reciprocate but tumbled sideways, its splinted leg throwing off balance. Instead of giving up, Hope developed a peculiar sideways attack that actually proved more effective, catching Shadow off guard. Elias found himself laughing, actually laughing for the first time in 5 years. "Emily would have loved you," he told them. And the words didn't hurt the way they usually did. "She always wanted a cat, but Maggie was allergic. I told her maybe when she was older." The sentence died unfinished. But for once, the silence that followed felt like peace rather than pain. Luna began teaching her cubs to hunt using the rope toy Elias had braided from old cloth. She demonstrated the stalking crouch, the patient wait, the explosive pounce. Shadow copied her perfectly, a miniature Shadow indeed. Hope watched intensely, then modified the technique for its limitations, developing a rolling attack that used momentum instead of muscle. Elias watched Luna observe this adaptation with what looked like pride. She never tried to force Hope to hunt normally, instead encouraging the innovation with gentle chuffs of approval. That evening, while the cubs napped, Luna did something extraordinary. She approached Elias directly, not for food or necessity, but with deliberate intent. She rubbed her massive head against his shoulder, marking him, claiming him as part of her family unit. The gesture nearly undid him. His hand rose without thought to rest on her broad head, feeling the powerful muscles beneath silk fur, the trust of it overwhelming. They sat that way until darkness fell, two parents who'd known loss, finding comfort in shared vigilance. The third day, Wednesday, brought troubling signs. Elias heard snowmobiles in the distance, engines violating the forest's cathedral silence. Through binoculars, he spotted markers being placed, the systematic grid pattern of organized search parties. Luna heard them too, her ears constantly swiveling, a low growl building whenever engines came too close. She began pacing, muscles coiled with the ancient urge to flee that had kept her species alive for millennia. "Not yet," Elias told her, though he knew she couldn't understand words, only tone. "Running now leaves tracks in fresh snow. Tonight, when it starts snowing again, I'll create false trails. We're going to outsmart them. Luna, that's what humans do best. We think our way out of problems." She stopped pacing to look at him, and he could swear she understood the promise, if not the plan. Thursday morning shattered their fragile peace with the roar of approaching trucks. Elias had barely finished coffee when he heard voices, loud and aggressive, the sound of men pumped up on adrenaline and possibility of profit. Through the window, he counted 4 of them, Tom Brennan leading. Of course, everyone knew Tommy, former high school football star turned professional disappointment, who'd returned home to nurse grievances in his father's hunting supply store. With him were Jake Porter, whose family had lost sheep to something last winter, and 2 others Elias didn't recognize, probably out-of-towners drawn by bounty postings. They had dogs, big hounds bred for tracking bear and cougar. They had rifles that cost more than most people's cars. And they had technology Elias recognized from his Ranger days thermal imaging equipment that could detect body heat through walls. His blood went cold. The root cellar wouldn't hide Luna's heat signature. They needed a better plan. And fast. "Stay silent," he whispered to Luna, who'd already gathered her cubs beneath her body, making herself as small as a 200-pound predator could manage. Elias grabbed his own rifle, dusty but serviceable, and stepped onto the porch before they could reach his door. "Morning, Tommy," he called out, forcing casualness into his voice. "Hell of a storm we had. You boys lost." Brennan's smile was all teeth. No warmth. "Elias Whitefeather, heard you were still hiding out here like some kind of hermit. We're tracking a big cat killed 3 of Porter's sheep, left prints bigger than my hand. Trail leads this direction." "Haven't seen anything," Elias said, letting appropriate concern color his voice. "But then, I haven't been out since the storm started. You're welcome to look around outside, but I'd appreciate you keeping those dogs off my porch. They're making enough noise to wake the dead." Jake Porter, younger and more eager, was already scanning the cabin with a thermal scope. "Getting some heat readings from your place. Old man, running something hot in there. Wood stove and a space heater," Elias replied evenly. "Pipes nearly froze night before last. You want to come in and check my heating bill, or are you planning to actually track this cat?" Brennan's eyes narrowed. He'd never liked Elias, not since Elias had reported his father for poaching 15 years back. "Mind if we look inside just to be thorough?" "Actually, I do mind," Elias said, rifle shifting subtly in his grip. "Unless you've got a warrant, you can get off my property. I know my rights, Tommy, and I know Sheriff Johnson wouldn't approve of you harassing law-abiding citizens." The mention of the sheriff made them pause. Marcus Johnson was a good man who played by the rules, and he wouldn't look kindly on unauthorized searches, bounty or no bounty. But Elias could see Brennan calculating, weighing the odds, the money almost visible in his eyes. A soft thump from inside the cabin made everyone freeze. Elias's heart hammered, but he forced a laugh. "Damn raccoons got in through the chimney last week. Been knocking things over ever since." He prayed they'd buy it. Prayed Luna would understand the danger and stay hidden. The dogs suddenly went crazy, baying and straining toward the cabin. One broke free, charging toward the door before Jake grabbed its collar. "That ain't no raccoon scent getting them riled," Jake said, suspicion thick in his voice. Elias was preparing for the worst when salvation came from an unexpected source. A familiar pickup truck bounced up his access road, and Dr. Sarah Morningstar stepped out, all 5 feet of her radiating authority despite her gray hair and grandmotherly appearance. "Elias Whitefeather, you missed your medication appointment," she announced, then seemed to notice the hunters for the first time. "Tom Brennan, what are you doing harassing my patient, and with those filthy dogs? You know Mr. Whitefeather is recovering from severe PTSD. The last thing he needs is you playing soldier on his property. We're tracking a dangerous animal." "Doc," Brennan said, but his aggressive posture had shifted to defensive. Everyone knew Dr. Morningstar had been treated by her at some point, and she had a way of making grown men feel like scolded children. "The only dangerous animals I see are the 2-legged kind bringing guns to a sick man's door," she said sharply. "Now get off his property before I call Marcus and tell him you're interfering with medical treatment. And Tommy." She fixed him with a stare that could freeze flame. "Your mother would be ashamed of you. May she rest in peace." The mention of his mother hit home. Brennan's face flushed red, but he signaled his men to fall back. "This isn't over. Whitefeather, that cat's worth $5,000, and I mean to collect." They loaded into their trucks, dogs reluctantly following, and drove away in a spray of snow and diesel fumes. Sarah waited until they were gone, then turned to Elias with raised eyebrows. "PTSD treatment. Really? That's the best I could improvise. Now, You want to tell me what's really going on? Because those weren't raccoon sounds I heard, and we both know it. Elias hesitated for exactly 3 seconds before deciding to trust the woman who'd delivered Emily, who'd held Maggie's hand during 16 hours of labor, who'd shown up to the funeral despite the blizzard. You'd better come inside, Sarah, but prepare yourself. What you're about to see, it's impossible. Sarah followed him through the door, medical bag in hand as always, and stopped dead at the sight of Luna rising to her full height, cubs visible beneath her protective stance. For a long moment, Doctor and Panther regarded each other with mutual assessment. Then Sarah did the most remarkable thing. She sat down slowly on the floor, making herself small and non-threatening. "Well," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same calm she'd used when Emily was crowning and Maggie was screaming. "I've seen bears in kitchens and moose in swimming pools, but this is a first." She looked at Elias with eyes that held no judgment, only curiosity. "That splint on the little one's leg, your handiwork. It needs adjusting. Lucky for you, I've got 30 years of veterinary experience nobody knows about. Couldn't afford vet school and medical school, so I taught myself. Now, let's see what we can do for this extraordinary family you've adopted." As Sarah carefully approached Luna, speaking in the same soothing tones she'd used with countless frightened patients, Elias felt the walls of his isolation crumbling further. He'd thought he was alone in this impossible situation, but here was Sarah, accepting the miraculous as if it were merely unusual. Luna, perhaps sensing another healer, allowed the approach. "The hunters will be back," Sarah said while examining Hope's leg with gentle expertise. "Tommy Brennan never could let anything go, and $5,000 is enough to make him stupid. We need a plan. Elias, a real one." She was right, of course. The brief reprieve Sarah had bought them wouldn't last. But as Elias watched her work, adjusting the splint with practiced efficiency while Luna watched trustingly, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the strength that comes from not being alone. They were an unlikely alliance, a broken man, an elderly doctor, and a panther with her cubs, but sometimes the most impossible families were the strongest. "I've got some ideas," Sarah said, producing a notebook from her bag. "Did you know the federal government just approved a new wildlife sanctuary that includes your land?" "Well, they're about to. I have connections from my activist days. We're going to make this legal. Elias, we're going to protect them properly." As she outlined her plan, Elias felt the first real hope since the night Maggie and Emily died. It was dangerous, possibly illegal, certainly crazy, but looking at Shadow playfully attacking Sarah's shoelaces while Hope watched with intelligent eyes, he knew they'd risk everything. Some things were worth saving, worth fighting for, worth believing in even when the world insisted they were impossible. The storm was returning, clouds gathering for another assault, but this time Elias welcomed it. Let it snow, let it hide their tracks and give them time. They had work to do. Thursday night descended like a predator, moonless and thick with renewed snowfall. Elias had spent the afternoon following Sarah's instructions, filing false reports of panther sightings 20 miles north, creating misleading tracks with modified snowshoes, and preparing what he prayed would be enough decoys. But at 9 p.m., the rumble of multiple engines shattered his fragile preparations. Through the window, he counted 6 trucks, their headlights cutting through darkness like accusatory fingers. This wasn't just Brennan's crew anymore. They'd brought reinforcements. Sheriff Marcus Johnson stepped out of the lead vehicle, his face grim beneath his campaign hat. Elias's heart sank. Marcus was a good man, but he was also a lawman who followed orders, and the badge on his chest meant this was now official. Behind him, Brennan's crew unloaded equipment that made Elias's blood run cold, military-grade thermal imaging, the kind they'd used in Afghanistan to hunt insurgents. They'd see through walls, through lies, through any hiding place he'd prepared. "They're coming," Elias whispered to Luna, who was already gathering her cubs. Her golden eyes held understanding, and something else, resignation. She'd been hunted before, knew the inevitability of human persistence, but Elias wasn't ready to surrender. Emily's room, the toy chest, now. He led them quickly to his daughter's bedroom, untouched these 5 years, a shrine to interrupted childhood. The toy chest sat beneath the window, hand-carved by his grandfather, big enough for a child to hide in during games of hide-and-seek. Emily used to curl up inside with books and flashlights, creating worlds within worlds. Now it would hide two panther cubs while their mother faced whatever came next. Luna understood instantly, nudging shadow and hope into the chest among stuffed animals and forgotten dreams. Elias layered Emily's heavy quilts on top, the ones that still smelled faintly of her strawberry shampoo. The cubs stayed silent, trained by instinct to hide when mother said hide. Luna gave them one last look, a soft chuff that sounded like goodbye, then followed Elias back to the main room. The knock came hard and official. "Elias Whitefeather, this is Sheriff Johnson. I need you to open up. We've got reports of a dangerous animal in this area, and I'm authorized to search premises for public safety." Elias opened the door, rifle visible but not threatening. "Evening. Marcus. Bit late for house calls, isn't it?" Johnson's weathered face showed genuine regret. "I'm sorry about this, Elias, but 3 more livestock kills today, and now a child claims she saw a Black Panther near the school. Town council's in a panic. I've got papers here, signed by Judge Morrison." He held out the search warrant like an apology. Behind him, Brennan smirked with vicious satisfaction. "Told you he was hiding something. Sheriff, my thermal scope's picking up multiple heat signatures inside. Large ones. That's my wood stove and space heaters," Elias said. But even he heard the desperation in his voice. "Marcus, you know me. Would I harbor something dangerous?" "I knew you, Elias," Johnson said quietly. "But you've been alone out here 5 years. Grief changes people, makes them do things they wouldn't normally do. Step aside, please. Let's make this quick and clean." They flooded in like an invasion, boots tracking snow across floors Maggie had kept spotless. Brennan immediately raised his thermal scanner, sweeping it across the room. The device's screen glowed with heat signatures the stove, the heaters Elias had desperately set up, and there, behind the couch, a large shape trying to remain motionless. "Got something," Brennan shouted, rifle swinging toward the corner. "Big heat signature. Right there." What happened next occurred in fragments, like a film strip breaking apart, Luna rising from her hiding spot, magnificent and terrible. Brennan's finger moving toward the trigger, Elias stepping between them without thought, his own rifle raised. "You shoot her. I shoot you. Tommy, that's a promise." "Stand down, both of you," Johnson commanded, hand on his sidearm but not drawing. His eyes fixed on Luna with professional assessment. "Jesus Christ. It's really a panther. Black Panther in Algonquin. Nobody's going to believe this." $5,000 bounty believes it just fine," Jake Porter said, rifle trained on Luna. "That thing's a killer. Sheriff, public safety. You said we need to put it down." Luna hadn't moved, hadn't attacked, hadn't done anything but stand there, every muscle tense but controlled. Her eyes found Elias's, and in them he saw trust. She was waiting for him to fix this, believing somehow that he could. The weight of that faith nearly broke him. "She's not a killer," Elias said, surprising himself with his steady voice. "She's a mother. She came here to give birth during the storm. She's got cubs. Marcus, 2 cubs that need her." "Bullshit," Brennan spat. "Even if that's true, makes it worse. Breeding population of predators. That's an invasion, not a rescue." The room bristled with weapons and testosterone, violence hanging like smoke in the air. Elias could feel it all balanced on a knife's edge, one wrong move away from massacre. His finger rested on his trigger, knowing he couldn't win but willing to die trying. Luna seemed to sense it too, her body coiling for what would be her last fight. Then salvation arrived in the unlikeliest form. Sarah Morningstar walked through the still open door like she owned the place, carrying an official-looking folder and wearing her most imperious expression. "Sheriff Johnson, thank God you're here. Though I specifically asked you to wait for federal authorization before approaching this property." Johnson blinked in confusion. "Sarah, what are you talking about? What federal authorization?" She produced documents from her folder with theatrical flair. "This is a protected research site under the Endangered Species Act. We've been monitoring a remnant population of puma concolor cougar eastern cougar, thought extinct but recently rediscovered. This female is tagged and tracked, part of a breeding program to restore the species. She fixed Brennan with a withering look. And you almost shot her. You ignorant fool. Do you have any idea what the federal penalties are for killing an endangered species? That's impossible, Johnson said. But uncertainty crept into his voice. There hasn't been a panther in these parts for 70 years. Exactly what we wanted people to think, Sarah replied smoothly. The program's been classified to prevent exactly this kind of vigilante hunting. I have documents here from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She handed Johnson papers that looked official enough to pass casual inspection, complete with seals and signatures Elias suspected she'd forged in her truck. Johnson studied the documents while Brennan seethed. This is bullshit, Sheriff. You know it is. She's making this up to protect Whitefeather. Maybe, Johnson said slowly. But can you prove it? Because if these documents are real and you shoot that cat, you're looking at federal prison. Is $5,000 worth that risk, Tommy? While the men argued, Sarah moved toward Luna with the confidence of someone who'd been doing this for years. Subject 77 Alpha, she said clearly, as if reading from a scientific protocol. Lactating female, approximately 8 years old, postpartum condition stable. Luna, somehow understanding the theater of it, remained still as Sarah pretended to examine her from a safe distance. Cubs located and secured. Sheriff, 2 juveniles, 1 with congenital defect being monitored for research purposes. You've been hiding panther cubs in here, Johnson asked Elias, disbelief and something like hurt in his voice. Christ, Elias, do you know how dangerous that is? No more dangerous than letting Brennan and his thugs murder them? Elias replied. They're babies, Marcus. One of them is crippled. They came here for help, and I gave it, just like you'd give it to any creature that showed up at your door needing shelter. The moral weight of that statement hung in the air. Johnson was a father, a grandfather. Everyone knew how he'd nursed orphaned raccoons in his garage, how he'd spent his own money to save the police dog when the town wouldn't pay for surgery. The conflict played across his face like weather duty versus decency, law versus right. Sarah pressed her advantage. Sheriff, I have documentation here showing Tom Brennan's hunting group has been involved in illegal poaching for 3 years. She produced a tablet showing trail camera footage. Night hunting, baiting, hunting out of season. Jake Porter shot a doe with fawns last spring. Tommy himself has been selling bear gallbladders to Chinese medicine dealers. That's a goddamn lie, Brennan shouted. But Porter had gone pale. The truth of it was written on his face. I've been collecting evidence for federal prosecutors. Sarah continued calmly. Wildlife crimes are federal jurisdiction. Sheriff, 1 call from me, and these men are looking at serious time. Or, she paused dramatically, we can all walk away from here tonight. They forget about the bounty. I forget about the poaching, and everyone goes home safe. The silence stretched like a held breath. Finally, Johnson holstered his weapon. I think we've made a mistake here. Boys, appears this is a federal matter, outside my jurisdiction. We should leave before we contaminate an active research site. You can't be serious, Brennan protested, but Johnson's hand on his shoulder was firm. I'm completely serious, Tommy. And if I hear about you or anyone else coming near this property again, I'll personally make sure those poaching charges Sarah mentioned find their way to the right desk. Understood. The fight went out of Brennan like air from a punctured tire. He knew he was beaten, caught between federal fiction and documented truth. This isn't over, he muttered. But it was the complaint of the defeated, not a real threat. They filed out into the snow, engines starting one by one, headlights retreating until darkness reclaimed the forest. Sarah waited until the last sound faded before slumping against the wall. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, I can't believe that worked. Those documents won't hold up to real scrutiny. Elias, we've bought time, maybe a week at most. But Elias wasn't listening. He'd collapsed to his knees, 5 years of suppressed emotion breaking through like a dam failure. The guns, the threats, Protecting these cubs while remembering another child he'd failed to protect, it was too much. His body shook with sobs that seemed to come from his bones, grief so profound it bent him double. Luna approached him then, this wild creature who should have fled at his weakness. She pressed her great head against his shoulder, a rumbling purr vibrating through her chest. It wasn't quite comfort. Panthers didn't understand human grief, but it was presence, solid and real and alive. She stood guard while he broke apart, as if recognizing a fellow survivor of loss. "I couldn't save them," he gasped between sobs. The road was gone, washed out. Maggie was so sick, burning with fever. Emily kept asking why Daddy wasn't driving to the doctor. I tried to carry them, both of them, through the snow. But it was too far, too cold. They died in my arms. Sarah. Both of them. Just stopped breathing. And I kept going. Kept breathing. When I should have died with them. Sarah knelt beside him, her own eyes wet. But you didn't die, Elias. You survived to be here. Tonight. To save these three. Maybe that's why. Maybe every terrible thing leads to one necessary moment. From Emily's room came a small, mewing cry. Hope, calling for his mother. Luna looked toward the sound, then back at Elias, torn between duties. He wiped his face, forced himself to stand. "Go to them," he said roughly. "They need you." As Luna padded toward her cubs, Elias watched her go and felt something shift inside his chest. Not healing, not yet, but the possibility of it. Hope struggled to walk on his splinted leg, taking 3 wobbling steps before falling. But he got up, tried again, fell again, tried again. Just like Emily learning to walk. That determination that didn't understand impossibility. "We're going to fight for them," he told Sarah, and his voice was stronger now, tempered by tears into something unbreakable. "Whatever it takes, however we have to do it, we're going to keep them safe." Sarah smiled, the kind of smile that had welcomed hundreds of babies into the world. "I know we are. I've already made the calls. Real federal contacts from my activist days. They're interested, Elias. A remnant panther population would be the conservation story of the decade. We just need to keep them safe for another week while the paperwork goes through." A week. 7 days to protect the impossible. To guard this miracle that had walked through his door on legs of shadow and starlight. Elias looked at Luna grooming her cubs, at Hope still trying to walk, at Shadow pouncing on moonbeams. His family was gone, would always be gone. But life, stubborn and insistent, had found him anyway, demanded he participate again in its terrible, beautiful struggle. "Then we'd better get to work," he said, and for the first time in 5 years, he meant it. The storm outside was picking up again, but inside, surrounded by the impossible made real, Elias Whitefeather began to believe in second chances. Not redemption, not yet, but the possibility that saving others might slowly, carefully, teach him to save himself. Friday dawn arrived with the weight of inevitability. Sarah had stayed through the night, making calls that grew increasingly desperate as federal bureaucracy proved slower than promised. The real wildlife officials were coming, she'd confirmed, but not to help to remove. Relocation to appropriate facilities, the email had said, which meant cages, separation, and the slow death of wildness behind bars. They would arrive by noon, armed with tranquilizer guns and legal authority that no forged documents could counter. Elias watched Luna pace the cabin with increasing agitation. She understood something had shifted, could sense his distress in the way animals read the chemical signatures of fear. Her golden eyes kept returning to the window where dawn painted the snow pink as blood. Shadow played with fearless energy, already showing the powerful build that would make him a successful predator, but Hope struggled even to stand, the splint helping but not enough, never enough for what survival in the wild demanded. "She knows," Sarah said quietly, watching Luna nose Hope repeatedly toward Elias, then pull him back, then push him forward again. God help us. She knows he won't survive out there. The mother panther's internal battle was visible in every movement, instinct warring with love. Survival against sacrifice. She would position Hope near Elias, then return to groom him furiously as if she could lick strength into his twisted leg. Shadow tried to engage his brother in play, but Hope could only manage a few stumbling steps before falling. Each fall seemed to break something in Luna's eyes. We could keep him, Elias said, though he knew the impossibility of it. I could raise Hope, teach him to adapt. Sarah shook her head sadly. The Rangers won't allow it. They'll take all three. Elias, the best we can hope for is they keep them together in captivity. But they both knew that was unlikely. Facilities would separate mother from cubs, cubs from each other. Hope would probably be euthanized kindly, they'd say, humanely as damaged goods in a system that had no room for imperfection. Luna made her decision as the sun climbed higher, with deliberate intent. She carried Hope in her jaws so gently despite those killing teeth and placed him directly in Elias's lap. The cub mewed in confusion, trying to return to his mother, but she blocked him with her massive paw. Her eyes met Elias's, and in them was the same terrible clarity he'd seen in Maggie's eyes that final night. The parallel hit him like a physical blow, doubling him over with the force of memory. 5 years ago. Another Friday. Another impossible choice. Maggie burning with fever that had spiked too fast, too high. Emily coughing that wet, drowning sound that meant pneumonia had set in. The radio dead, phone lines down, and the access road washed out by unseasonable rain that had turned to ice. Take Emily, Maggie had gasped, her hand burning against his cheek. Leave me. Take her. You can make it if you're only carrying one. But he'd refused, stubborn in his belief that he could save them both. He'd bundled them up, Maggie over his shoulder, Emily in his arms, and started the impossible 12-mile trek through the storm. 3 miles in, Maggie had stopped breathing, her body going limp with that terrible finality. He'd tried CPR in the snow, Emily watching with eyes too knowing for 6 years old. Another mile, carrying his dead wife and dying daughter, before Emily had whispered, "It's okay, Daddy. Mommy says it's okay to let go." She'd died clutching her favorite toy, a black panther she'd named Lucky because black cats aren't really unlucky. Daddy. People just don't understand them. He'd carried their bodies the remaining 8 miles, feet frozen, heart frozen worse, arriving at the hospital with cargo that no longer needed saving. Now Luna was offering him what Maggie had begged for, the chance to save one by letting go of the rest. Her eyes held that same terrible trust, the faith that he would do what she couldn't. Hope mewed again, tiny paws kneading against Elias's stomach, and the sound broke through 5 years of frozen grief like spring through ice. I'll take him, Elias heard himself say, though his voice seemed to come from very far away. I'll protect him, raise him, teach him to be strong in his own way. I promise, Luna. I promise I won't fail this time. Luna studied his face with those ancient golden eyes, weighing his words against some internal measure of truth. Then she turned to Shadow, grooming him thoroughly, imprinting her scent deep into his fur. The healthy cub protested, wanting to play, not understanding this was goodbye. She picked him up by his scruff, his body going limp with instinctive submission, and moved toward the door. Wait, Elias said, scrambling to open it for her. The Rangers, they'll be watching the roads. Take the north trail through the gorge. It leads to the old-growth forest across the federal boundary. They can't follow you there without Canadian permission. It'll buy you time. And Luna paused at the threshold, looking back at Hope one last time. The cub called for her, that high, plaintive sound that should bring any mother running. Every muscle in her body tensed with the urge to respond, but she held firm. She looked at Elias once more, and in that gaze was everything gratitude, trust, sorrow, and the fierce love that could abandon in order to save. Then she was gone, melting into the forest with shadow dangling from her jaws, leaving only tracks in snow that the rising wind was already erasing. Hope cried for hours, the sound drilling into Elias's skull like accusation. But he held the cub close, humming that old Ojibwe lullaby, the same one he'd hummed to Emily as she died, the one his grandmother had promised would guide lost spirits home. Sarah found them like that when she returned from her useless calls, man and cub curled together in shared abandonment. "The Rangers will be here in an hour," she said softly. "I've done what I can. I've told them the mother abandoned a defective cub, that she's gone, probably dead. They might believe it if we're convincing enough." Elias looked down at Hope, who had finally exhausted himself into sleep. The cub's twisted leg twitched with dreams of running he'd never quite achieve. Just like Emily in her final sleep, chasing something beautiful just beyond reach. But this time, Elias had been given a chance to change the ending. Not redemption, nothing could restore what was lost, but the possibility of honor in the trying. "Then we'd better get our story straight," he said, standing with Hope cradled against his chest. The cub weighed almost nothing, light as hope itself, fragile as second chances. Through the window he could see the last of Luna's tracks disappearing into the tree line, erased as if she'd never existed at all. When the Rangers arrived with their trucks and cages and clipboards full of regulations, they found an old man and an elderly woman with a crippled panther cub, and a story of maternal abandonment that happens sometimes in nature. They searched, of course, sent teams into the forest with dogs and thermal equipment. But Luna was already miles away, across boundaries both physical and legal, teaching Shadow to hunt in forests that remembered when his kind owned the night. Elias signed papers accepting temporary custody of the abandoned cub, pending federal review. The Rangers left with warnings about wild animals and legal consequences, but also with the exhaustion of officials who had bigger problems than one old man and one damaged cub that would likely die anyway. They didn't see what Elias saw when he looked at Hope, not just a broken animal, but the universe offering him one last chance to get it right. That night, as Hope slept between Elias and the warmth of the fire, Sarah asked quietly, "Do you really think you can save him?" Elias thought of Maggie's last words, of Emily's toy panther, of Luna's trusting eyes. "I couldn't save my family," he said. "But maybe that's not what this is about. Maybe it's about learning that love isn't measured by what we save, but by what we're willing to sacrifice to try." Outside, the wind howled through empty spaces where Luna's presence had been. A mother's lament carried on the darkness. But inside, cradled in the warmth of a second chance, Hope slept on, dreaming whatever dreams came to creatures caught between wildness and love, between what nature intended and what kindness could build from broken pieces. Saturday morning brought Sheriff Marcus Johnson back to Elias's door, but this time his face carried news instead of warrants. The snow had stopped, leaving the world crystalline and sharp, every branch etched in white clarity. Hope lay curled in Elias's lap, having finally accepted goat's milk from a bottle after a night of refusing everything, his small body trembling with grief for a mother who wouldn't return. "Tommy Brennan's in federal custody," Johnson said without preamble, accepting the coffee Sarah offered. "Arrested last night trying to cross into Canada with a truck full of bear parts and eagle feathers. Jake Porter turned state's evidence. Apparently Tommy's been running a poaching ring for 3 years, selling to international buyers." Elias felt no satisfaction at the news, only a tired relief. "What about the bounty? The panther hunts?" "Called off. Town council's facing a federal investigation for authorizing hunts on what turns out to be protected land." Johnson pulled out a thick envelope. "Which brings me to why I'm really here. These came through this morning from the Department of Interior." Sarah's hands shook as she opened the documents, her eyes widening as she read. "Elias, this is impossible. Your land, the surrounding 1,000 acres, it's all being designated as critical habitat for species recovery. The Eastern Cougar Recovery Zone. Effective immediately." "That's not the interesting part," Johnson said, his weathered face showing something that might have been wonder. "Sarah, why don't you tell him the truth? The whole truth this time?" Sarah set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, her eyes meeting Elias's with decades of secrets suddenly visible. The Panthers never left. Elias, not completely. There's been a remnant population in these mountains for 70 years, maybe 12 to 15 individuals living in the deepest parts of the wilderness. I've been documenting them since I came here in 1982. The revelation hung in the air like suspended snow. Elias stared at the woman he'd known for 20 years, seeing her anew. You've known all along, all these years. My father was Abenaki, Sarah said quietly. He told me stories of the ghost cats, the shadow walkers that the tribes protected even as white settlers tried to exterminate them. When I became a doctor here, I also became their guardian. Secret cameras, careful documentation, misdirection when hikers reported sightings. I've been sending data to sympathetic scientists for decades, building a case for protection that couldn't be ignored. She pulled out a tablet, showing Elias trail camera footage that took his breath away. Panthers moving through moonlight, mothers with cubs, young males establishing territory. And there his heart stopped a familiar female with a crescent scar on her ear. Younger, but unmistakable, playing with two tiny cubs near a stream. Luna, he breathed. I called her Patient 7 in my notes, Sarah said. First documented 12 years ago, right after you freed her from that trap. She's had 3 litters that I know of. Lost most of them to weather, disease, predators. Shadow and Hope are probably her last chance at passing on her genes. She's older than most breeding females. Johnson leaned forward. Here's the thing. Elias. With Brennan's arrest and the federal investigation, everything's changed. The protection order isn't just for show, it's real. With real funding and real consequences for violators. The feds want to establish a breeding program, bring in genetic diversity from Florida panthers, create a viable population, and they need local cooperation. They want you, Elias, Sarah said directly. Former ranger, experienced tracker, already proven capable of hand-raising an injured cub. The position comes with federal backing, a salary, and most importantly, legal protection for Hope and any other panthers on this land. Elias looked down at Hope, who had awakened and was batting weakly at his shirt buttons. The cub's golden eyes, so like his mother's, held trust that felt heavier than mountains. What about Luna and Shadow? Sarah pulled up a map on her tablet. The protection zone extends across the border. I've already been in contact with Canadian Wildlife Services. They're establishing a mirror sanctuary. Luna's safe. Elias, she led us to exactly where we needed to look. Almost like she knew. The weight of it all, the synchronicities, the secrets, the sudden reversal of everything made Elias dizzy. He thought of Luna's eyes that first night, the way she'd approached his door specifically, not randomly. She did know. Didn't she, somehow? She knew I'd help. Animals know more than we give them credit for, Sarah said. Your cabin is built on an old denning site. Did you know that my father showed me panther bones in these woods from the 1800s? This has been their territory longer than it's been ours. Luna wasn't seeking a stranger's help, she was coming home. As if summoned by his mother's name, Hope struggled to stand on his twisted leg, managing 3 wobbling steps before Elias caught him. The cub's determination was absolute, that same fierce will that had kept his species alive in these mountains against all odds, hidden, waiting for the world to be ready to accept them again. There's more, Johnson said, producing another document. The university wants to establish a research station here. Veterinary facilities, observation posts, the works. They're talking about making this the center of Eastern cougar recovery. Sarah's been nominated to lead the medical team. 40 years of secret keeping finally paying off, Sarah said with a slight smile. All those nights tracking panthers instead of sleeping, documenting without publishing, protecting without recognition. I'm 73 years old. Elias. I was beginning to think I'd die with these secrets. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of day that made the world seem newly made. Elias stood at his door with Hope cradled against his chest, watching the tree line where Luna had disappeared 2 days ago. The cub had finally eaten properly, his little belly round with formula, but his eyes still searched for his mother. She'll come back, Elias said. though he wasn't sure if he was comforting Hope or himself. Maybe not today, maybe not this season, but she'll come back to check on you. Mothers always do, in their own way. Sarah arrived with a truck full of supplies, medical equipment, specialized formula, physical therapy tools for Hope's leg. "The first federal team arrives tomorrow," she said, unloading boxes. "Biologists, veterinarians, bureaucrats with checkbooks. Your quiet life is over, I'm afraid." But Elias found he didn't mind. The cabin that had been his tomb for 5 years suddenly felt alive with purpose. Hope needed daily therapy, hourly feedings, constant care. The work was exhausting but filled the empty spaces that grief had carved into his days. When the cub curled against him at night, purring with contentment despite his challenges, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced since before the tragedy needed. Marcus Johnson returned that evening with unexpected company. "Found these in Brennan's truck," he said, producing a box of documents. "Thought you should see them." Inside were years of surveillance photos of Elias's cabin, notes about his movements, and most shocking, pictures of Luna from months ago, heavy with pregnancy, approaching his property. Brennan had known, had been watching, waiting for the valuable pregnant panther to be vulnerable. "He was using you as bait," Johnson said grimly. "Figured she'd come to the only human who'd ever helped her. If Sarah hadn't intervened when she did..." The revelation reframed everything. Luna hadn't just sought help, she'd walked into a trap, knowingly, trusting Elias to be stronger than the danger surrounding him. Her faith had been absolute. And somehow, impossibly, it had been justified. That night, as Hope slept between Elias and the fire, a sound drifted through the darkness, a panther's call, distant but distinct. Hope's ears perked up, a tiny answering mew escaping his throat. The call came again, closer, and Elias understood. Luna was out there, checking on her cub, making sure her sacrifice had been worthwhile. "She's okay," he whispered to the darkness. "We're both okay. You did the right thing, Luna." The calls continued periodically through the night, a mother's lullaby across impossible distance. By morning, they had stopped, but Hope seemed calmer, as if he too understood that love could bridge even the space between wildness and civilization, between what was lost and what could still be saved. The truth, Elias realized, wasn't just that panthers had survived in these mountains. It was that they had thrived, hidden, protected by a network of guardians who understood that some things were too precious for the world until the world was ready. Now, finally, that time had come. The shadows were stepping into light, and he, broken as he was, had been chosen to help guide them. "Tomorrow," he told Hope, who was attempting to climb his chest with determined awkwardness. "Tomorrow your new life really begins. Doctors and scientists and people who will help you grow strong. But tonight, you're just mine, and I'm just yours. And that's enough." Outside, somewhere in the Canadian wilderness, Luna taught Shadow to hunt, both of them safe under international protection born from sacrifice and secrets finally revealed. The panthers had come home, and in saving them, Elias had found his way home too. 1 year later, the spring sun warmed Elias's face as he watched Hope navigate the obstacle course they'd built together. The young panther's gait was uneven but purposeful, his twisted leg no longer a disability but simply a different way of moving. He'd developed a rolling lope that covered ground with surprising efficiency, using his powerful shoulders to compensate for his weaker hindquarters. The federal veterinary team called it a miracle of adaptation. Elias called it hope living up to his name. The cabin had transformed beyond recognition. Where once grief had hung like cobwebs in every corner, now life bloomed insistently. The walls displayed charts of Hope's progress, photographs from trail cameras showing the expanding panther population, crayon drawings sent by school children who'd heard about the special panther boy. Emily's room had become Hope's den, though the young cat preferred sleeping at the foot of Elias's bed, purring through the night like a guardian against old nightmares. Sarah arrived for their weekly session, her truck loaded with medical supplies and fresh venison from a road-killed deer. At 74, she moved slower but with purpose, finally able to practice her true calling openly. "He's gained another 8 pounds," she announced after examining Hope. Perfect weight for his age, considering his limitations. Hope had learned to hunt. After a fashion, Elias had started with toy mice, then graduated to releasing live rabbits in the enclosed yard. The young panther's technique was unorthodox, using stealth and patience rather than speed, developing an ambush style that would have made his mother proud. He'd never survive alone in the wild. They all knew that, but he was magnificent in his own way. "Any word from the tracking stations?" Elias asked, though he already knew the answer from Sarah's expression. "They're back," she said simply. "Crossed the border 2 nights ago. The cameras picked them up near Mitchell's Creek, about 3 miles north." Elias's heart hammered as he processed this. Luna and Shadow had been spotted periodically over the winter, always together, the cub growing into a powerful young male under his mother's tutelage, but they'd kept their distance. Ghosts in the data, never approaching human territory. Until now. That afternoon, while Hope napped in a patch of sunlight, Elias felt the change before he saw it. The birds went silent, that peculiar hush that meant apex predator presence. He moved to the window, and there they were, Luna and Shadow, standing at the forest edge like a memory made manifest. Shadow had grown magnificent, already matching his mother's size, his coat lustrous with health. But it was Luna who took Elias's breath away. She looked older, gray touching her muzzle, but still powerful, still regal. Her golden eyes found his through the window, and time collapsed. She'd kept her promise to survive, and now she'd come to see if he'd kept his. Hope woke instantly, some deep instinct alerting him to his family's presence. He gave a cry Elias had never heard before, not the domestic mew of a tamed creature, but something wild and ancient. Luna answered with a deep chuff that vibrated through the walls. Hope scrambled to the door, his twisted gait forgotten in desperation to reach his mother. Elias opened the door with trembling hands, and Hope tumbled through, rolling more than running toward the 2 panthers. The reunion was everything and nothing like human sentiment would paint it, sniffing, circling, Luna grooming Hope's ears while he pressed against her, relearning her scent. Shadow approached more cautiously, this brother he barely remembered, but soon they were touching noses, communicating in ways beyond human understanding. For an hour they stayed in the yard, a family rebuilt from fragments. Hope showed them his territory, his adapted way of moving, even attempted to demonstrate his hunting technique on a butterfly. Luna watched with what Elias could only describe as maternal pride, while Shadow seemed protective, positioning himself between Hope and any imagined threats. As the sun began its descent, painting the mountains gold, Luna approached Elias where he sat on the porch steps. She pressed her great head against his shoulder, that same gesture of trust from a year ago. Then she turned to Hope, chuffing softly. The young panther looked between his mother and Elias, understanding the choice being offered. Hope took 3 steps toward Luna, stopped, looked back at Elias. Then he did something extraordinary. He returned to Elias, pressed against his legs in clear affection, then walked to his mother and touched noses, not choosing, but bridging. He belonged to both worlds now, the wild and the gentle, the fierce and the healing. Luna seemed to understand. She groomed Hope once more, thoroughly, then turned toward the forest. Shadow followed immediately, but Luna paused. Looking back, Hope made no move to follow. He'd chosen his path, different from theirs, but no less valid. Luna gave one last look at Elias, those golden eyes holding gratitude, understanding, and something that transcended species, the recognition between parents who'd done their best with impossible circumstances. Then they were gone, melting into the trees like smoke returning to sky. But this time, Elias knew they'd return. The sanctuary had become a crossroads where wild and tame could meet safely, where different kinds of survival were equally honored. Hope curled against Elias's side as darkness fell, purring with contentment. Through the window, Elias could see the lights from the new research station down the valley, where Sarah was probably documenting the day's encounter. Tomorrow would bring more work therapy sessions, feeding schedules, the endless dance of caring for a creature caught between worlds. But tonight, Elias sat with hope on the porch, watching stars emerge like promise kept. His family was gone, would always be gone. But love had found him again in the most unexpected form, proving that sometimes salvation came on 4 legs instead of 2, with golden eyes that saw past human grief to something simpler and more eternal. Some families are born of blood, he whispered to Hope, who rumbled agreement. Others of choice, but the rarest are born of trust between worlds. In the forest, a panther called Luna's voice carrying across the darkness. Not goodbye, but until next time. Hope answered with his own call, imperfect but powerful, and Elias smiled. They were all exactly where they needed to be, broken and whole, wild and tame. Separate but forever connected by that night, a desperate mother had knocked on a stranger's door and changed everything. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, while below, an old man and a young panther kept watch together, guardians of the impossible, proof that love could bridge any distance, heal any wound, and sometimes, just sometimes, offer second chances that were worth the pain of accepting them. I've told you this story because I need you to understand something I learned too late. Gratitude isn't just a feeling we humans possess. It lives in the golden eyes of a panther who remembers kindness, in the twisted leg of a cub who chooses to stay with the one who saved him, in the return of a mother checking on the child she had to leave behind. We think family means sharing blood, but I've learned it means sharing trust. Luna taught me that. She knocked on my door not because I was special, but because I was broken enough to understand that sometimes love means letting go, and sometimes it means holding on despite everything telling you to run. Hope still lives with me. He's 5 now, magnificent in his imperfection. Every spring, Luna and Shadow return, and we sit together, the living and the lost, the wild and the tame, proving that bridges between worlds aren't built from strength, but from the courage to be vulnerable. Maggie and Emily are still gone. That wound never fully heals. But saving Hope taught me that honoring the dead sometimes means opening your heart to the living, even when they arrive on 4 legs, asking for the impossible.